Let's talk about what I/we read with my kids. This is a video, I guess, just about the many books we read with my children, which I don't always review on the channel, and which is his own topic really in terms of how we select books, what makes a good book to read with our kids, and what's succeeded, what's not. And I know some people will probably find that interesting for their own purposes. And may also reflect or reminisce on their own childhood and what they read then. Now, when I say we read to our children every night, they also listen to an e-audio player called Yoto, the Yoto player. And that has loads of cards, and they listen to loads of books, and I will not be reviewing those books or considering those here because I have listened to many of them. Not all of them. We try to listen to all of them, or we do listen to all of them before they do, but I haven't heard all of them, and it's not like I'm thinking, oh yeah, these are the books that I've selected. There are some very good books there that aren't here, stuff that I've enjoyed listening to parts of. And there are many other kinds of kids' books which, either because of some lack of familiarity on my part, or because of the kind of book they are, I won't be mentioning. So the Alfie series, which is very good fun from what I listen to, I don't really know that well. Or things like chapter books and early reader books, and lots of things that we do read and which can be very fun. Things, Oxford Reading Tree, Magic Key stuff, Teddy Horsley, Hafty Hamster, lots of other books which we've enjoyed reading with them. So this is more sort of books which maybe are paragraph, they might be chapter book length, but individually, but most are much longer, most ones we've read, and where they are shorter, they're very much classics of the genre. So that's a criterion about selection for this video. So what I'll talk about now is criteria of selection for what we read to them, and then what I've thought about it over time. And just to say, the things I picked up first were Winnie the Pooh and The Hobbit. So that's two that we'll be talking about. But I'll talk about. I'll go through. I've got a big pile here, lots and lots of books here. As I say, we read every night, so we read lots of books with them, and lots of types of things as well. And the main criterion for selection of books is that we have some reliable report that they're good. That sounds maybe trivial, maybe everyone does that, but I know some people might say, oh, well, I really want to try all kinds of stuff. Or I read one article online that said this was a good series, and all power to people making their decisions. But for us, we're like, yeah, we want to know this is good. We want to know that it's going to be something we're not going to have to spend lots of time explaining the wrong things on. And that will come to a second criterion I'll mention in a second. But, where you end up being like, okay, is this quite the right angle? And stuff we think is life-giving, is is nourishing, emotionally, spiritually, whatever, nourishing. And so that is a criterion. It doesn't lead to only one kind of book getting selected, but it's something worth saying, that it's not like we're like, oh, well, essentially what we're choosing to read for our sake, we're reading it, but also for their sake, we try to give nutritious actual food, so trying to give nutritious intellectual, emotional food is quite important too. And and so you can get stuff like, you can read book lists. Honey for a Child's Heart, for instance, this classic like American book list is really interesting. One thing you find with lots of book lists, especially if they're American book lists, I'm talking about for me, if you're American, they're probably ideal. But as I'm like, I don't really know half of this stuff, or a bunch of this stuff is very specifically culturally, historically American, and that's interesting in small doses and for particular reasons. But you kind of end up being like, okay, maybe this isn't quite what we need. So it's been a process of selection from stuff we've already read, stuff we are recommended. People say, oh, this is a really good book, and it's all these people have said, so this is a real classic of the genre. And there may be some research required ourselves. Very rarely for books we haven't read at all do we then do a pre-read, I should say. This is one of the reasons why there's a benefit of being like, okay, I'm looking here at Nesbit, or The Borrowers by Mary Norton, or Narnia. I mean, we've read Narnia many times, but stuff where you've got so many recommendations, you can accurately tell if you're going to like it or not. So there is part of the point of the reviewing process, and this is often forgotten by critics, is to actually try to explain to people whether this is going to fit, what the point of this is. And yeah, so I mean that is just to kind of give a basic overview of that first criterion. That's that. The second criterion, which connects to the first, which is about appropriateness. And I'll mention the age of the kids here, and then I'll discuss what I think about picking appropriate books. They're all about to have a birthday. We've got 4, and they're all fairly soon going to have a birthday. So I'll give their new ages because that's what we're reading to now, really. 7, 5, 3, and 1. The 1-year-old obviously doesn't care at all. The 3-year-old doesn't, she likes listening to reading. She likes listening to her Octonauts Yoto card. And she likes listening to ballet music, like she has some opinion about these things, but the amount she's engaging, it's more passive. The 7 and the 5-year-old, currently 6 and 4, but about to turn 7 and 5, are much more engaged and are, themselves reading, and they care about this to a greater degree. And it's really fun and enjoyable. This is a great part of the pleasure of reading, is to kids, just like for yourself, you're like, oh, I really enjoyed that or this, but part of the interaction with kids about them responding emotionally, whether even sometimes where it's more tempestuous emotion, but responding with some emotion, responding with an aesthetic response, responding to humour, and knowing they're enjoying it, it's a great delight. And so yes, the ages we're picking matter, because it means that, for instance, I've got some books I bought here actually. We not recently read Gravity's Rainbow by Thomas Pynchon to them, or indeed Anais Nin, Children of the Albatross. 2 good examples actually, semi-randomly just because they're next to me. But Gravity's Rainbow, aside from anything else, going to be too tough, I think. In the days of the gauchos, my country was a blank piece of paper. The pampas stretched as far as men could imagine. The tyrant Rosas has been dead a century, but his cult flourishes. A last sad look from Squalor Dotsy alone at his table, a toss of forelock, a fading of light. The plane is a battered DC-3, chosen for its affinity to moonlight. Now, linguistically, that's not super hard. A book that is linguistically very tough is going to be more of a problem, though some challenge is good, and I'll mention that in a second. But stuff that is stylistically very dense is going to be, and this is why we've not got our baby's first Gene Wolfe yet, stylistically dense stuff is going to be hard to deal with for the 7-year-old, let alone the 5, 3-year-old, whatever. And it doesn't mean you should never read anything that's more complicated, but I'm just saying, as a selection point, you pick stuff that you think they're going to be able to engage with to some degree. I'll mention some qualifications to that in a moment. Again, Anais Nin, it's full of explicit sex. And I think this is one thing, occasionally someone will say, I don't think any parent would fully, any sane parent would fully defend this position, but sometimes someone will say very understandably, I want to trust my kids, and I think, if stuff goes over their head, that's okay. So can't we just read anything? And of course, actually no one thinks that, because they're not reading detailed accounts of war crimes. They're not reading erotic fiction to their kids. And I say that non-flippantly, I'm saying, like, we don't think that, no one thinks that. Everyone is making decisions about nutritious food for their children. In the same way with TV, like the reason that Peppa Pig is indefensible, I'm completely dead sincere there, is because you can't say, well, the kids just watch anything, don't they? Because you don't let them watch anything. And it's the same with books. So in that sense, content being age appropriate matters. By the way, I bought this bundle for the Gravity's Rainbow and Borges Labyrinths. They're both in it, but I got some Anais Nin and some other random stuff I have no interest in. So there, in that case, even I'm like, I've read some Nin. She's a good stylist, but it's not really my content, really. And ever so much more, and obviously this might seem a ridiculous example, but I'm making the point that both for stylistic density and for content, explicit gruesome violence, sex, things like that, I'm not going to read to my 7-year-old. And you could say, well, of course, we don't go for the extreme examples, but that means I'm selective, and I am fairly strictly selective. It'll be something where there will be points, you think, I'm reading, is this book going to just step over the line? And I think you can imagine something like, for some of that stuff, certainly Harry Potter. Let's say you read, we haven't read Harry Potter to the kids yet, but let's say we did. And I think you can imagine Sorcerer's Stone, Philosopher's Stone being a bit scary at points, but maybe it's okay for the 7-year-old, blah, blah, blah. But by the time you're getting, if we read through them quickly because they're being enjoyed, and we get to Order of the Phoenix, or End of Goblet of Fire, Order of the Phoenix, Deathly Hallows, Half-Blood Prince, and we get to scenes of torture, and we get to scenes of kind of function, like just unpleasant, tragic death, because the bad guys are bad. You get to that kind of stuff, and you get to growing romance, and that's maybe less pointed there. That much of that may go over their heads, or only hit them as much as seeing Brock in Pokemon, but you get the point I'm making. You could imagine that could rapidly become a thing which emotionally the tools aren't there to digest, and which then requires kind of conversations which are very hard to frame because you can't really explain the particular thing except in the most general terms. Obviously, if your kid just accidentally reads or hears something like that, you will usually, as a parent, be able to, I think, respond and offer some help. I'm saying about what we introduce. And so, yeah, I give the example. So obviously not Pinchon, Ananias Nin, but also, there's reason to be cautious about X, Y, or Z. His Dark Materials is a good example, actually, because of the what starts as a younger YA book with serious themes. I'm talking about also His Dark Materials rather than Book of Dust here. Starts as younger YA, but there's no way you can say Amber Spyglass is younger YA. It's very much older YA into real young adult stuff that is really aimed at teenagers who have passed that whole bracket and above. And it's, this is actually part of the weird comparison to Narnia. In fact, it maybe becomes more relevant as a comparison to the Space Trilogy, but because it simply no longer exists for the same market. And so we haven't read any of the HDM books, though I'm sure one day either we will or more to the point, I suspect they will. But you get the general idea, the gist of what I'm saying. So selection criteria are legibility, the ability not to, we're not reading Finnegan's Wake, we're not reading Thomas Pynchon, we're not reading June Wolfe, and also propriety, not in terms of no challenging material, and I'll give examples as we go through, but just there is a bar to be reached where we think, if this is something with the conversation to try to frame it or explain it, where it has come through, and I'm thinking violence is probably more obviously pertinent there, in terms of how much your kids immediately understand it. It's just going to be too much, and then they're going to be upset and not understand stuff, and so there's no point. So yeah, anyway, those are the criteria, the main ones. And so we'll just, I've got a ton of books here. I'll talk about what's worked, and this has mostly worked. We'll talk about a bit about some stuff that has less so, maybe just a tiny bit about the future. The Hobbit, we read The Hobbit. The kids loved it, the boys loved it. It's exciting, it's funny, it's got battle scenes. Chip the cup, smash the plates, that's what Bilbo Baggins hates. It's very good, and it'll bear a reread. I mean, it's a funny thing where I think maybe we finished it just over a year ago, and you think the ages are going so quickly and the memory is going so quickly that maybe it's time to come back to it. But we also are thinking, it's funny, you might read what I've just said. Lord of the Rings, I'm actually would be probably mostly happy with, other than for Peril, and that's a judgment call. As a comparison, we've watched Star Wars: A New Hope with them, but we haven't watched Empire, and we'll probably watch A New Hope again with them, and maybe in a year or so or two come to Empire. Empire is much darker and more emotionally strenuous, and it's visual as well, but Lord of the Rings, the Peril is maybe the thing that, compared to this, in terms of density of meaning, is not so much of a trouble, but stylistically, because though it is dense in meaning, it's stylistically fairly easy. This is one of the things, it's just not true that this is this impossible book to understand. I think, and that's badly overstated. I know I read it for the first time when I was maybe short of 10. I think maybe I was 8 or something, 8 or 9. So, and I got enough out of it. Winnie the Pooh, we love the films based particularly on these stories. There are 2 of the Winnie the Pooh films are based on these stories. The others are often a bit hit or miss, and they have both audiobook cards. We have read, I think we've only read the first one to them, plus rhymes. This is a complete collection of both books and the various poem collections. So Winnie the Pooh, House at Pooh Corner, When We Were Very Young and Now We Are Six. And these are relative. I mean, you've got basically 100-page book each time with some very lovely illustrations in this particular case. The kids do have access to this version. I'm not sure how much they've read this. We first read it manually out of a 2-language version of Winnie il Pooh, because it's also in Latin. So yeah, Winnie the Pooh is it's sweet and it's funny and visually appealing if you're reading it, or indeed watching it, but reading it. It's got songs and things that are quite easy to connect to. And it does have some good stuff. You know, it is quite a sincere and earnest thing, and I value sincerity and earnestness. And so I certainly, you know, we have enjoyed that and would recommend it. Let's work out the system for moving these books, because otherwise we're going to get swamped. A whole category of books we have read is, and this is going to bear some comment, I guess, for reasons obvious to most people, Enid Blyton books. So, for instance, we've read The Enchanted Wood, we've read the Brer Rabbit stories, and we've read lots of Famous Five and Secret Seven with them. And I grew up reading, particularly at my grandma and grandpa's Famous Five books. And I had a Secret Seven collection, which I think we still have somewhere, but we now have the paperbacks. Blyton was very productive and a very capable writer, just very good at getting stuff down. And there's gifts there, right? Just being able to write stuff, getting it out, and it's good. You know, it's good for a job. And you know, she deserves the reputation she has of being very good. There are some interesting points in terms of for and against revision. Is actually, these are 97 editions. These are before any of the more recent Bowdlerizations. It is complicated, I think, more so than you might think. Basically, I would generally say I'm against changes. However, there is a point of purpose. Are things fit for purpose? And the reason I'm against changes is because I think there is a certain censoriousness and a kind of cultural revolutionism to be like, okay, well, we'll just remove the past from, you know, it doesn't exist. The past was bad. And if we need to keep any of it, it needs to be entirely sanitized. That's a bad attitude, but we're talking about purpose. And the problem is if there's stuff, and I'm thinking about the famous Agatha Christie book. Can I see it up here? It must be somewhere around. Yes, this one. Let's get it out. And Then There Were None. The Agatha Christie collection version of And Then There Were None. That is not the name of the book, if you want to put it that way. It has had 2 previous names based on a nursery rhyme, very Agatha Christie-like, and it doesn't even in this printing admit what the previous names of the book were, and one of which I'm fairly sure I should not say on the channel. But yes, 10 Little Indians was the immediately prior name. And there's a fit for purpose thing here of like, okay, so it's a famous book, well loved. There's nothing offensive in the use of a nursery rhyme which has terms which people may consider offensive. By that I mean it is simply a device to say, Hickory Dickory Dock, Pocket Full of Rye, many of her other ones, to have this odd sort of connection between something which is an easy hook and which also lends us an eeriness to it. And yes, in that case, I think, you know, it's effective. But then if you see that name on the shelf, you might be like, okay, what's this about? Or you might be like, oh, wow, I'm offended. I'm upset by that. This must be something bad. And so you suddenly get a problem where things are functionally being misrepresented in terms of their purpose or whatever. And I've never found massive problems with these books, but there are moments, certainly you read, you know, you can find examples of this odd thing she said. And so, you know, you're going to have to judge that. I actually think probably my own instinct is that generally speaking, I am happy to do the Bowdlerization as I read. And I'll give an example of that. you know, but Baudelaire gets in a sense a bad rap because, I mean, in fact, a fair rap, but a bad rap in some respects for the whole process of sometimes you do edit for children. The idea, Charles Kingsley wrote, he didn't have everything in his Shakespeare retellings. The actual Bowdlerisation, which is the controversy with Blyton is and with Roald Dahl, is how far are you deleting intent and meaning from writers because you're upset by it. It's much more egregious with the Dahl stuff. The Dahl stuff is actually so horrendous to read the changes and embarrassing. Like, imagine writing the complete tripe that has replaced his very well worked phrases. If you're watching this video, person who wrote it, I recommend you publicly apologise. But you know, there's an argument for some of these things. With Blyton, you know, we haven't found it a big problem. I think my wife is very occasionally, when reading the 5 and 7 books, found a line where she's kind of going, okay, I'll just slightly change that. I think it's actually often to do with weirdly abusive language between the children, which is something where we're like, do we really want to encourage the kids to call each other that? So yeah, it's actually not even offensive stuff. It's more, again, nutrition. Let's talk about someone who does not need, I don't think I've ever needed to Baudelairize, E. Nesbit, considered correctly one of the all-time great children's writers, a great inspiration to many very important writers, you know, your Lewises and Neil Gaiman. Neil Gaiman, of course, can reliably blurb everything, but the one thing in his favour is he's usually blurbing good things. Recommendations on, for instance, are Jacqueline Wilson, Frank Cottrell Boyce, Neil Gaiman. I don't know who Kieran Millward Hargrave is, I'm afraid. Kate Saunders. You know, you've got big name recommendations. This is a little short story collection, The Last of the Dragons. And the main books to speak about, she wrote, I think, 40 books. There are really 7 of these novels which remain very important and are fully regularly in print. We got matching ones, Virago Modern Classics. These are just the first books of the series. There's the Samiad trilogy, starting with her second most famous book, probably, 5 Children and It. The Treasure Seekers, Bastable Stories, and the standalone Railway Children. We actually just finished this one tonight. We've read all the rest. And we're getting on with the Treasure Seekers, which is probably the funniest of them. And it's an interesting one as far as these things go. I'll probably do a review of it, but her range is very wide. The Samiad books about a kind of grumpy little sand fairy who can grant wishes, they are fairly wonder-filled, and here's going to a new place, here's a wonderful wish, but it's gone comically wrong. There's humour in them, she's very funny, but there's a particular vibe there that is a little more sober than some other things. The Railway Children is an odd one because it definitely has humour in it in a way that possibly more sometimes than the Samiad, but the Railway Children is pulling your heartstrings. It's a bit of a tearjerker. It's really pushing a lot of your emotional buttons. And Treasure Seekers has some emotional weight. It's actually one of those rare beasts, the thing that actually has layers of meaning that hit the adult and hit the child differently. And it's very well done, and the children have loved it. It's very funny, certainly, and it hits multiple levels. And she has this range. In every book, though, there is a bunch of children who are looking for something, doing something, have access to something, have a problem, you know, all these things. And so she basically does that, and so it is much like, in that sense, like the 5 and the 7, but they are better books, I think. Blyton, there is a certain kind of, she's written so many books, you know, I don't have Mallory Towers there, but, you know, she's written so many books for so many people, so many subgroups, and, you know, great. Why not read them? They're good fun. Nesbit, though she was productive, her core work is less big, but it's just very, very, very respectable. It's very, very good quality. You know, you're hitting stuff that is real all-time classics at an individual level in a way that probably isn't true for Blyton. Let's get a couple more. The Moomin Stories by Tove Jansson. There's 8 sort of main books, I guess, and then there's some shorter strip books as well. And this is about a family of forest trolls and weird people they pick up and adopt. and there's lots of very lovely, I mean, your line drawings in there. I mean, it should remind you of your European landscapes, your romantic landscapes. You've got very nice covers in these. These are the Sort of Books editions, which we have with the nice dust covers and kind of very nice bright and block printed inners. So yes, the Moomins just have this really strong inventive vibe that goes alongside the fact that they're this family that, this family that welcomes people in, that creates a home for people, which is, but in a world of infinite found family books, it's not that, or it is, where it is that people find that there is a household, there is a last homely house, if you will, which welcomes and protects. And I think when I think about the trope of the found family is so fundamentally saturating a lot of YA and adult fiction, it is interesting to come here. And the same with reading about, in your Enid Blytons and in your E. Nesbits, the idea that there is actually a family unit, and in this case one that welcomes and includes. Which, yeah, they are funny, they are inventive, they're quirky, and though they are, there is an increasing pensiveness to them, and essentially Jansen stopped writing them because she started just feeling gloomy about it. I think this was really about her own stuff, to be clear. She wasn't like, the inner conflict of the Moomins has broken me. But it does mean you have some more sombre books and more thoughtful and pensive books at the back end. Tales from Moomin Valley in November. Mary Norton, The Borrowers, adapted by Studio Ghibli as Arrietty, for those who know it from there. There's also a TV series. Was it a film? No, film in the 90s. Oh no, major TV series, maybe both actually, I think. It's about little people who live under the floorboards and so on. Homily Pod and Arrietty, and they are they live off what they borrow, but essentially, yeah, Arrietty, I don't really count this as a great spoiler, but Arrietty is spotted, and there's conflict comes out of the spotting of Arrietty. Of course, Narnia, both, we have read some of them manually, but we're also now listening through, chiefly on audiobook while travelling, and we've listened to together Lion Witch Wardrobe, Prince Caspian, Dawn Treader, Silverchair, and we've started Horse and His Boy. Narnia is a wonderfully realised vision of the world, this great medieval planetary vision. I've talked about this in detail elsewhere, but translated into children's books, it has its religious aspects, it has its moral and ethical aspects, it has its inventive aspects. You realise there are points of genuinely, in the T.S. Eliot sense, poetic writing, visionary writing, like in The Silver Chair, the vision down into Bism, or indeed the Great Exchange, a different kind of poetry, the Great Exchange between Puddleglum and the Lady of the Green Kirtle, but for invention in the truly poetic sense rather than simply interesting things, the vision down into Bism, or the sights of Aslan's country and the land in the sun and the endless wave at the end of Dawn Treader, things like that. Just this incredible power. A highly enlightened imagination with great style, working at high intensity. We're talking about along with some stuff like The Hobbit and Nesbit. We're really talking about some of the best children's writing ever, in a way that most stuff that I'm discussing, though it's all, hopefully virtually all of it at least, good, just you got this, it's your S tier. And some people don't like it for one reason or another, and other opinions are available. But at a literary level, at a level of knowing how my kids have enjoyed it, at a level at which it sets their imagination on fire, at the level in which it is kind of a blessing to them, Narnia has to be really up there with only a couple of other things. And so, yeah, this was not my first Narnia book. I do have a nice copy of the set of the Pauline Baynes front cover paperbacks, but they are an adult find, and I've gone through many other copies and given away many other copies. This was just a random trilogy. It's Nephew, Wardrobe, and Horse and His Boy. It's the chronological trilogy, which is not the right way to read it. Which means that Magician's Nephew has a very strong hold on my mind, actually, to be fair. I think I also had a TV, it's upstairs, a TV colour photocopy of from the 80s series with the text, which I'm not sure why we had it, but one thing that's relevant was the boy who played Peter lived down the road from us. So, yeah, there we go. Tales of Narnia, thoroughly recommend. Let's do some other English, British classics, well-known ones. So, here, I don't think this is all of them. I've got several. The Beatrix Potter, Peter Rabbit tales. We've got a large number of them. There are, I think, a few others that we do have. We also have the audiobooks. And these are ones which I think they are basically easy readers with very, very beautiful illustrations and memorable stories. And I think that there are very good reasons why these are well known and loved. I think that they have a power of concentration of getting across these kind of weird crises that people are in quite well, and communicating character, people like, I'm thinking about Peter, Benjamin, Bunny, Jeremy Fisher, people like that very well. And I think that is, certainly much to be praised. I like them, and I've always liked them. I don't think they excite me. That's one thing. When I think about like the kids' books that we read that excite me, or that I really just delight in, maybe less so for Peter Rabbit than some things. But certainly they are so beautiful and so memorable that, I think most people's kids are going to enjoy them. Similar sort of thing, maybe very slightly more complex, but which is in a different category for me. Thomas the Tank Engine, the Railway series, which this consists of 40 to 43 books, something like that. 26 which are by the Reverend W. Awdry, which is this collection, and the other 17 or 18 or whatever it might be are by Christopher Awdry, his son. They are good. I think actually there was one out in the living room earlier. They are good, and I have several. It's hard to get many of them individually for any kind of reasonable price, and the collection is very expensive. And my great eBay tragedy one time was that I had a bid out on, I think because they often go for like £150, $180, something like that. So beyond any reasonable margin. But I think it went, it went finally for just over £40, and I just was like, I can't afford to put much more money on this book, so I won't. And ever since then I've thought, no, if only I had. What a great price. But I don't think we've greatly missed it. But here, these are sentient trains. Let's see if we can get a picture. You can see a face of a Skarloey there or something. Oh no, it's a handle. And they are mostly steam trains, though diesels are introduced over time, first as antagonists, then occasionally you get some good hard-working ones. But this is Awdry's love letter to railways, to the trains that he and his son had. These were stories he originally read to his son. There's a parallel to The Hobbit there, and to Winnie the Pooh. But yes, they are the two things that are appealing are this kind of really wonderfully imagined world of the sentient engines and sentient buses and so on, and the problems they face. A big thing was that how much he based these stories. It sounds crazy when you read them, but no, he really was like, oh yeah, a railwayman told me about this crazy thing that happened, and I've kind of made it into. So Thomas goes fishing. There's fish in his radiator, in his reservoir, so he's uncomfortable as water's getting pulled through. That really happened to an actual engine, not a sentient engine. That'd be horrible if that happened in real life to a sentient engine. But the general kind of imagination of this system that he loved, one of the cleverest bits of engineering that's ever existed, at space rocket levels of coolness. And he created, I guess, especially post-nationalisation and then modernisation, increasingly a sort of hideaway for these, to the point that you even have literally runaway engines fleeing from being scrapped. He created a fictional hideaway for steam in the face of a world that was too efficient for it. The illustrations are generally beautiful. There is a massive variety of stories. A very good TV series for the first 4 seasons is what I recommend, which are based on his stories. The more modern stuff I find genuinely horrendous, but even a lot of the kind of previous stuff that still has the beautiful models, the kind of handmade, it's live action model work. The stories fall apart. But yeah, Thomas the Tank Engine, Railway Series, W. Awdry is, I think, a cast iron classic. Another English, sort of, this is more like Blyton, Richmal Crompton, Just William. This is William the Gangster. We have several other stories, and I think this was Ex Libris. I don't think I stole it in this case, but yeah, I've got a little library card, I think, from that one. William the Gangster, Richmal Crompton. But yes, Richmal Crompton was productive. It's interesting looking in the back. Richmal Crompton, Reg Dixon with Pokemoto, and Frank Richards, Billy Bunter, all listing the same thing. This is the Pocket Merlins, where you feel like a few hours of real reading enjoyment. A paperback with a smiling wisdom on the cover guarantees the very best in fiction, whether you like adventure or fun old favourites like William or Billy Bunter, etc., etc. It's definitely kind of bordering on the potboiler in a similar way, as I say to Blyton. Crompton is probably not quite as gifted a constructionist as Blyton, but is funnier. Basically, William and his friends Ginger and Douglas, and let's find out. There's another boy, I promise you. You can see him on the front, can't you? Henry. They are little squits, and they get up to no good, but they kind of got a heart of gold, and they, there's a parallel to, in terms of a better version of the same. Treasure Seekers has some of the same kind of, here's some kids who keep getting into scrapes playing their games, but there's a different vibe here. Is William is much more an agent of chaos. You've not been getting into trouble, have you, dear? Said Mrs. Brown, suspecting his sudden change of plans and having mental visions of impending visits from indignant farmers or neighbours. Of course not, said William in a voice of outraged innocence. I only wondered why you changed your mind so suddenly, dear, said Mrs. Brown. That was all. Oh, just because I'd like to stay with Aunt Florence, said William vaguely. He was silent for a few minutes, then assumed an exaggerated air of pathos. Do you want me to go away, Mother? He said. Of course not, dear, said Mrs. Brown hastily. Because if you give me half a crown, I won't, he offered hopefully. Of course I won't give you half a crown, said Mrs. Brown again, with spirit. Oh, all right, said William, who hadn't really expected her to. Some mothers, he couldn't help adding bitterly, would rather have half a crown than their own children. What are you talking about, said Mrs. Brown. But William, still maintaining his air of dignified reproach, went upstairs to pack without answering her. So yes, they're funny. They are pretty harmless. I mean, they're not actually encouraging your children to put dogs in fake amusement shows, or as if you were kind of a circus from the mysterious Orient. Probably, that's the thing that happens. They realistically represent the experience of your children wearing white clothes when they're near oranges. So yes, they're funny. They're good-natured. They're not classics, but they are just very funnily, competently written. Better than that, probably, in strict terms, but similar, The Indian in the Cupboard books by Lynn Reed Banks, which are actually British. They're about a British boy. A film in the 90s was American, but they're about a British boy, Omri, who basically he has a magical cupboard or key or something, and he puts his little plastic Indian in it. This is to say Native American, and this is the thing that actually gets investigated even in the first book. There's a lot of stuff about kind of getting real Native American culture down. But he puts his plastic Indian, basically, because that is the toy, in the cupboard. It comes out real. Little Bull is a Iroquois, and he has been time traveled somehow, and he's miniaturized somehow. And the 5 books are very good. They cover a lot of ground. They do pick up characters and threads. There are a couple of points which are maybe not completely resolved over that time. In a way, it's good in retrospect, disappointing, but not very disappointing. We thoroughly enjoyed it. As I say, there are 2 more. This is the first trilogy, and then there are 2 more afterwards. What are they called? So yeah, you've got Indian in the Cupboard, Return of the Indian, Secret of the Indian, Mystery of the Cupboard, Key to the Indian. And yeah, so you resolve this mystery of what the magic is over the course of this. You find out other things that can happen with the keys and the cupboards and so on and so forth. You meet many characters, and there is a lot of pathos, and there is a real degree of kind of Omri growing up over the course of the books, which is only a couple of years, of real relationships and the ways in which you really deal with people. By the end, by the last couple, probably even frankly by the middle, this transitions from Indian in the Cupboard is really middle gradish, high middle gradish, which is where a lot of what we're reading for our kids, we're aiming is middle gradish. We're reading it. If they're reading it on their own, it can be younger again, but for us reading it, it needs to be a bit more usually. It heads from middle grade, maybe older middle grade, into YA. And so when I talk about bowdlerization and editing, there are just a few moments in the last couple of books where I'm like, I'll just gloss over that. And this is kind of partly, as this goes back to the criteria I mentioned to do with legibility and propriety, and knowing exactly how you're going to discuss it if it becomes a thing where they're like, what does that mean? And yeah, it's nothing too intense or explicit or anything at all, but just that was our experience, was that we were happy to read through the last couple, but there was a process of adaptation, maybe on a half dozen occasions. Also older middle grade, heading into YA, slightly different kind of set of things going on. The Bromeliad by Terry Pratchett. I have many other Terry Pratchett YA and middle gradish books. Nation, Dodger, the Tiffany Aching books, The Amazing Morris and His Educated Rodents. I do not have the Johnny trilogy. I only ever read one of them. I enjoyed it. I haven't read the others, though my sense was and is that they are older than this. This is older middle grade into YA. Into young YA, whereas those are very much YA. The Bromeliad is about some gnomes who are, let's see if I can get the focus. You see these tiny guys on this digger? They are guys, tiny guys, just little guys, and they live in a department store, and they kind of have an entire worldview based on this department store, and the department store is going to get demolished and they have to move, and this is obviously a spiritual and religious crisis, and it's a philosophical crisis, and it's a logistical, practical crisis, and they've got a political thing where they've got to convince the other gnomes that this is really happening and that they have to do something. And it goes through, it's truckers, diggers, and wings, and so it's about them, generally speaking. Can you get, basically they're trying to work out how to operate a bunch of machinery, and it's funny. And it is funny, very funny, and we enjoyed it. I thoroughly enjoyed reading them. I think, and I do, just by the way, I like, not everyone does, I like omnibus editions that are decent quality. I like omnibus editions, and this is nice hardback. And it does actually have full colour boards. So this is a Ted Smart version. So yeah, it's good fun, and it is philosophical. As I've said before about Pratchett, to think he's a humorous writer, like, oh yes, he's a comedy writer, that Terry Pratchett fellow, isn't he, is accurate, but is also misleading, because it is probably not the most important thing about him in terms of what makes his writing great. It's what makes his writing good, why people want to read him to begin with. But in that case, we could read William the Gangster, which is quite funny, even though it's not as good as other funny books even. What I'm getting at is that what transcends in Pratchett and what becomes kind of the thing that keeps you engaged and coming back and thinking and wanting to reread and be like, what's going on here, is, and I don't mean in terms of mysteries what's going on, but there's some stuff here is that he's constantly trying to chew out stuff, and he doesn't give simple answers. He gives challenging questions. He sometimes gives answers you might not agree with, I might not agree with. But often he won't give a simple answer so much as attempt to represent people's responses and the complexities of the situation. And there are points, and I think there's a couple of good examples in this of what strikes me almost as you realise times change, and one thing, and time is very unforgiving to old certainties, and there are certainties of being a basically quite stable, happy, relatively liberal, progressive British person in the late 80s, 90s, which are very dead now and have been dead for a while, but which mean there are certain things that seem quaint, quite a quaint sense of philosophical confidence. But which, you can read in all kinds of books at any era. Pratchett is usually good enough and strong enough and humble enough that doesn't apply too often. But there are certainly moments. But I never felt like I was like, this is the kind of thing this is a complicated philosophical point, let's discuss it. Sometimes stuff like that comes up in the conversations with the kids, but this is where stuff going over your kids' heads is not a problem. That legibility in terms of them just being able to understand anything is a problem, but just the fact they can't get a theme or you can't discuss it in detail, well, who cares? Especially reading to a mixed group. Let's say you've got like a 10 and a 5-year-old and you found a book that is appropriate for them both. Do you only read books the 5-year-old completely gets? No, you probably read something that challenges and presses and pushes to some degree. And I certainly found Pratchett did. The Bromeliad, I think, was basically appropriate for them. I also thoroughly enjoyed it. So, yeah, I do recommend. Similarly challenging and pressing and pushing is Eagle of the Ninth, or the Dolphin Ring books by Rosemary Sutcliffe. This is the first chronological publication order, first 3. We've got another one, and I think there's 8 or 9 overall. And they're about ancient old Britain, not ancient, but old Britain from the Roman period through to the Norman period. And they are connected, this particular cycle, by the fact that a particular dolphin ring, which is on the cover there, goes through, which is a family heirloom, goes through all this time. And we are reading the second book, so I'm not an expert on the series as a whole, so I can't comment other than that people really like it. The first 3 books, these 3 particularly, are generally seen as, and they are young reader books that it describes here. Sword at Sunset, the 4th published book, the 5th chronologically or whatever, is seen as a more adult book, and some of the ones after that are seen as more adult too. Not adult in the sense of they're hyper-violent or anything like that, but I think just in terms of weight. And I would say stylistically these are, compared to, because I've been reading them alternately with the E. Nesbit books, stylistically these are much harder. And by that I mean they're just a bit more stylistically high and dense. They're not impossible to understand by any means. The Testudo is not a fighting formation, but for rushing a position, for a breakthrough, it had no equal. Also, it had a strange and terrifying aspect that could be very useful. Its sudden appearance now, swinging down upon them with the whole weight of the hill behind it, struck a brief confusion into the swarming tribesmen. Only for a moment their wild ranks wavered and lost purpose, but in that moment the hard-pressed patrols saw it too, and with a hoarse shout came charging to join their comrades. Lots of qualifiers, lots of subclauses, things like that, and just a little bit more challenging to read and so on. But no, these are really good books. Eagle of the Ninth is a really powerful book. Silver Branch, which we're like a third or halfway through, has been very interesting so far too. There's a slow ramp up. And it's a good reminder in terms of talking about not worrying about stuff going over their head. There's stuff where you're like, I don't think that's appropriate for them. But if it's just about a bit goes over their head, understanding that that's part of how you stretch their muscles, I think is good. And I think Eagle of the Ninth introduces new experiences compared to reading lots of the books I've already described. Some of them, certainly have emotional stuff in them or serious stuff. But here you have a really glorious story about friendship in Eagle of the Ninth, that is. And you've got, and so far in Silver Branch, you do have character arcs. You have a really strongly envisioned historical world, which is something which, yeah, historical fiction, and we read some other history and historical fiction of different kinds at times, and I'd like to do more of that. But it's something where obviously we might say, oh, well, we're reading a lot of fantasy, or are they really like, the Alfie books are relatively contemporary. They're not strictly contemporary, but relatively. So you're like, oh, we like that. Whereas I think some solid, weighty historical stuff, I know I always enjoyed watching and reading that kind of stuff. And I think, though, not to offer too simple an opinion, I think this is a better way to deal with it than horrible histories. I do think that, whatever the complexities of the different kinds of series. But I think giving good and earnest, serious stuff that your kids can, I'm talking about my kids here, can really get their teeth into and really imagine and engage with, both as educational, sure, but is also, as I've said, life-giving. It's something valuable, and it connects them to the great scarlet thread of our histories, and the fact that the past is never really dead. It always has some connection to us. That people in the past were people much like us. Good historical writing, whether in history books or on TV or in fiction, has to communicate the universality of humanity. It's both its good and its evil aspects, rather than creating a dichotomy between the bad old days and the good old now, or vice versa to some degree. That is less common these days, and has been less common for some time. But yeah, Eagle of the Ninth, Rosemary Sutcliffe, very fun, and kind of emotionally positive. Other historical-ish fiction is that we've read. We have the others. This is the Prairie series by Laura Ingalls Wilder, an American entry into this discussion. We have the others around. I have only read one of these, so I did watch some of the TV show Once Upon a Time, but I don't have strong opinions, therefore, on the whole series. But I think there is a charm and a relative seriousness, and a kind of, it's interesting that it's semi-autobiographical. It's a weird thing in a way, because you end up realising, okay, so this is sort of actually stuff happened in her life, but fictionalised, but then kind of told as a half autobiography. There's a weird genre thing going on, but I think, generally speaking, I don't think, for all the fact that you do get to the point of dealing with more adult events, I don't think it becomes problematically adult in terms of content. That's my understanding. But no, it's just, again, a wonderful depiction of what was, by the time that Laura Ingalls Wilder was writing it with her daughter. By the time she's writing it, it is some time ago. It is. There's a funny thing with the Western, by the way, that the first kind of Western films, your Tom Mixes, I think you even have, I'm not sure if his first film was actually, I think his first films were before, his first films were before the closing of the frontier in 1911. He knew Wyatt Earp. There's some Buffalo Bill Cody, people like that. You have the Western, and the Virginian by Owen Wister is out whilst the frontier is very much open. You have this odd thing where the Western crosses over. Till now, any Western happening now is well over 100 years since the frontier closed, and that's being made now. And Laura Ingalls Wilder, there's a kind of similar thing where you've got a lot of living memory of frontier settlement, but very few people it's not going on anymore, really. You have some of that frontier work still going on in Alaska, basically, and it's a different kind of frontier work. But here, yeah, you have this sort of living history, and I think there's going to be complexities to it. It's interesting thinking about the Indian in the Cupboard series, which does try to grapple with some of the complexities around the experience of colonization and cultural exchange, both positive and negative. And Little House does, my understanding is it does, from what I've read and from what I've been told, it does deal with some of that, whilst at other times having a pretty, maybe not so much a naive or fake view of history, but a very pragmatic one, that these are simply the encounter of settlers often looking for a better life with Native Americans could be very negative. But that, from the perspective of the settlers, because here we have a partial account, the response is understandably pragmatic. There was very little time to philosophize about these things while trying to carve out some patch of land to feed your family and provide for your community. You know, even if there are very serious moral questions that we can see, and even if there were some very bad things that happened. So, you know, in that sense, I think there's a historical note there of, this is going to lead to discussion. I think we talked about it during the Indian in the Cupboard readings, and I think my wife did when she's the one who read these ones specifically to the kids, discussion about the fact that there's there are upsides and downsides here to the historical events behind this, and we've got to deal with some of that, and we may react in different ways to some of that. And it's interesting, actually, that a really good example of this is exactly the kind of terribly unfashionable book now, Our Island Story by H.E. Marshall, which does a very good job of saying, look, you know, Duke William of Normandy, great man, very important, this is all so-and-so, but actually King Harold the Saxon, though he had promised King William, that was under duress, and that does create a bit of a tension there. And anyway, let's go back, and then we say, and then we've got the Saxons are coming over and invading and killing the Celts, and you know, the Saxons, of course, we will later hear, you know, become good English, good British people, and become part of this story. But the way that happens is very messy and unpleasant, and it goes back to, you know, a carefully phrased but nonetheless very difficult passage about Boadicea. The fact that this story is complicated, and I think that can come into discussions of books like this if you're worried about that. I don't think it's impossible to, but and it is partly dealt with in those books themselves. We've only got a few more now. Charlotte's Web, bit of a classic. E.B. White, dealing with lots of quite serious themes. Roald Dahl, this is Charlie and the Great Glass Elevator. We've read a few. They love listening to James and the Giant Peach. They've got an audiobook of that. Read the Charlie books. Roald Dahl, I feel very selective about, because essentially, though he values kindness and he often has plucky young children who, I think maybe they've listened to Matilda too, or watched it, or watched a version of it. I don't think they've watched it. But plucky young children surviving terrible conditions, and good for them. I think and some degree of difficulty and horror in a small H sense, but you know, kids know about, they understand dragons exist, right? The Chesterton quote, they need to know they can be slain. But there's also a limit on that in terms of what, for younger children, we really want to be putting out there and saying. And I think you look at something like James and the Giant Peach, and mostly it's about James and a bunch of animals living in a peach. The Charlie books, you know, are about, yes, Willy Wonka is crazy, but the point is that's an essentially ultimately positive set of relationships. And other books we might be more cautious about on that basis. I think they have read Fantastic Mr. Fox possibly as well. But yeah, I mean, I read lots of Roald Dahl, and you see what it did to me. They're good books. Again, they're classic books. I think they fit it. They trend the grotesque. It's Angelica Houston, wasn't it? Very famous version of The Witches, which I think was the kind of thing that scarred people. Movie version, and of course Gene Wilder in Charlie and the Chocolate Factory. So yes, I certainly do recommend them, with the caveat I think there's a selectivity involved, probably for Roald Dahl, for me. A few books. Secret Garden, I think, is the only Frances Hodgson Burnett book we've read to them, but there's obviously also The Little Princess, and there is another book by her, isn't there? Little Lord Fauntleroy, that's it. I've not read that, but Little Princess, film that my sister watched a lot when we were young, which I just found terribly depressing. I might prefer it now. Secret Garden, very lovely, kind of wacky and weird, and there might be some framing on some of the kind of philosophy going on in it. It also starts with, if you want to remember that cholera is just dreadful, it starts with like everyone dying from cholera. Good thing we got rid of that. Hygiene is important. So yeah, it's about a girl whose family dies and she goes to stay elsewhere, and things are tough, but then a set of relationships develop, and healing might come through that, and through a garden, through discovering a garden, and through growth, green things. It's a Hobbit-esque thing. I don't think Hodgson Burnett has aged as perfectly as some writers. I don't mean she's aged badly, I just mean there's probably some degree to which she hasn't, you can tell that it's just a bit schmaltzy, it's just a bit much at points. So, that's a caveat, but it's not much of a caveat. I think they are deserved classics. And again, with the kind of bit of framing, I find them good. No framing necessary, just absolute all-timers. The Jungle Book and the second Jungle Book, reviewed on this channel. We massively enjoyed these. The Mowgli stories are, generally speaking, the ones you really come away from. There are some like Rikki Tikki Tavi and the White Seal, which are in the first Jungle Book, are both exceptionally strong non-Jungle Book stories. They're all supposed to be from the same. The author has gathered these stories from animals around the world. Most of them are set in India. One in each book is set in cold climates. Two Eye of the Elephants is decent. Her Majesty's Seventh is funny. Those are non-Jungle Book. The Miracle of Purim Bhagat is decent. That's actually pretty good, actually. The Undertakers is decent. Cuiquen is Inuit, an Inuit story, and is good. But the Jungle Book stories themselves, the Mowgli stories, of which there are 8, 3 in the first, 5 in the second, are very, very good. And it's interesting, partly because they start good. They do start like, oh yeah, this is really good. Like Mowgli's brothers, okay, well, he's found his family, he's been saved. Kaa's hunting R. So this is when Kaa and Mowgli, because Kaa, by the way, is a good guy in the book. Kaa and Mowgli go to, or Kaa basically goes to rescue Mowgli from some naughty monkeys who have kidnapped him. And then Tiger is about Shere Khan. Okay, great. Good arc there. And that seems to be its own arc and story that finishes. But I think partly because of the success and partly because there's obviously an internal energy to these Mowgli stories that has stuff left to be done. He makes more. How Fear Came, Letting in the Jungle, The King Ankus, Red Dog, and The Spring Running. And I'd say Red Dog is a sort of crescendo of something. It's an incredible. My boys remember it very vividly. We read it a year ago or something, and it's an incredibly powerful story about lots of things: coming of age and family and anger and courage. Lots of things are going on, and this has been being built up to from Tiger through to at the end of the Spring Running, and so you get an arc, and you get stuff that's happening with Mowgli's character and personality as he grows into a man from a baby. You have a whole life story in that sense, many lives inside it, and you have these glorious other characters, Baloo and Bagheera and Arkela and Kaa, most obvious, the obvious, and Raksha and the other wolves, Grey Brother. You get some very good characters. As I say, Rikki Tikki Tavi is also probably of all of them also a categorical success. And here's an odd one. If you want to think, so obviously Jungle Book used as the basis for in scouting Cub Scout leader names. One of the few you'll see. I mean, they're mostly characters from the Mowgli stories, and Kipling was important, as an inspiration for scouting in general. Kim, which is a very good book, which you could read to 7-year-olds. I think, there's a lot going on that they won't get, but you could certainly read to 10-year-olds. But yeah, that was very important for scouting too. But yes, Rikki Tikki Tavi is good enough that it's a classic leader name for Cub Scouts. So yeah, the Jungle Book, no reservations, just good. We read poetry. This is something that's being used at the moment. Nursery rhyme for every night of the year. There's also, I think there's one for every day, and there are sometimes riddles and things as well. And you've got lots of Edward Lear in here. Oranges and Lemons I've randomly opened to. My problem with Oranges and Lemons, that when I've heard it sung around the house, is I just assume that O'Brien is about to walk out or something, and I'm about to go and be tortured. It is a nursery rhyme, I'm afraid, that's been ruined for me. But yes, lots of classics that you'll have heard of, lots of Edward Lear as well in this book. But I've read other poetry. I read Macaulay's Lays of Ancient Rome when they were very little, mostly because I thought, well, they're not going to understand the dark stuff in that. And that's the thing where actually, if you've got a 2-year-old and a 0-year-old, you can read whatever you want, probably. I say that my daughter, I don't think you could get away with that with her. But yes, read a lot of Ballad of the White Horse by G.K. Chesterton. And at one point when I was just coming in to be like, I need to read till they just go to sleep, and they enjoyed that. And Ballad of the White Horse, by the way, is just such a great poem. I thoroughly recommend it. But yeah, so we read poetry to them, and try to keep up. At one point we read a lot of Longfellow, the Tales from the Wayside Inn. And there's a pattern of life thing here, by the way, as to what helps and what doesn't. Reading a story at night has always been the case, but other stuff fits in or doesn't fit in based on all kinds of reasons. And significantly, you just run into the fact that life gets busy or changes, and a thing that worked I'm talking about with small kids. It does, maybe it always changes for everyone, but for small kids, everything is changing all the time, particularly when you have more than one. I suspect it's very different. And so you change your pattern. And poetry is the kind of thing that has worked in some situations and not in others, to read long form, to do this or that. But yes, I think musicality, the fact there's a music, and obviously The Hobbit has a bunch of poems in it, and Lord of the Rings will, whenever we do read that. And that's good. Musicality and getting them engaged at that level is good. You are putting in or drawing out whatever a good thing there. A couple of things we haven't read yet. I'll say one thing that didn't quite work. One book is, I think, up on the bedside. Anne of Green Gables, which is Canadian, I think, isn't it? Essentially here, I think, though it wasn't inappropriate or anything, I think my wife read maybe the first one, or most of the first one. But basically, and there's a couple of reasons I think this was, but it was clear it wasn't quite catching attention. And she was enjoying it enough to want to read it. And she's now read over half of them. But I think the things it ran into was, one, she said, very talky. So though it's age appropriate in most respects, it's very talky, and it's just Anne talking a lot, and that probably isn't always engaging to younger children. Also, it may matter to some degree that the older two, who are engaging most, are both boys, and they are books with a very different vibe. It's a thing that is interesting, by the way, about what authors write what, because it's not a kind of So the best, or all the best authors for children, for boys, must be male authors for that reason. Because of course, E. Nesbit writes books which very often, often give a very strong perspective for both sexes. Railway Children is a really obvious example of that. Samiad to some degree. Bastable Treasure Seekers, I think, because it's Oswald narrating, it does have a slightly different thing going on. But there's a really strong appeal to the whole self in that. And I think possibly Anne of Green Gables is more narrow. They're, as far as I can tell, justly considered classics, but that hasn't quite worked for us. Stuff we're going to read or have not read. I haven't read, and I probably will read at some point. Again, sort of pop, not the better than Pot Boiler stuff from the middle of the 20th century. Biggles. There's the boy Biggles, W.E. Jones. Mostly he is in the special police, and he's fighting Nazis or arresting drug smugglers. This one's actually about him growing up. You got things like Biggles, Pioneer Air Fighter. Biggles of 266, that will be of 266 RAF, Squadron RAF. Biggles of the Special Air Police, things like that. And I think much like Just William, there end up being weird repetitions and continuity things just because so many of these stories came out. But I remember I've read a couple, thoroughly good fun, but haven't read them to the kids yet. And I might go back and read one just to be like, what exactly am I going to be? What's the translation process? By the way, reading old books, old money, things like that, that's interesting to find out about. So but translation process, the cultural stuff, as I've said, can include more complicated things than that. We haven't read Wind in the Willows. We do own it. I think maybe we read it. I didn't read it to them, but maybe my wife read it when they were much younger. But due a reread. And they haven't watched it either. And so there's a thing there, I'm like, that's a book I last read a long, long time ago. There's a few other books that we have, like Binky Bill, the Blinky Bill, Australian koala book, which I enjoyed reading as a kid, which I'd like to read to them at some point, I'm sure. Watership Down, I read as a child. I'm not sure if I should have. Very strange book, like those books by Richard, whatever his name is, I'm afraid. I forget, Shardik as well. Things like that are weirdly framed, what they are, who they're appealing to. And there's a bunch of books, like, there's a bunch of other books we could read, and I'm sure we will read. But there's others that are kind of on the short list. And I'm not sure exactly what will come next, but I think what will come next for me, apart from Eagle of the Ninth books, because there's so many left to read, is the Prydain Chronicles, which we just got, which I have been interested in for a while, and I think it's just a couple of quid at a second-hand bookshop, and got a couple of other books at the same time. And I don't know much about them other than the recommendations. I think I have seen Disney's The Black Cauldron. You could say something, say T.H. White's Arthurian stories, Once and Future King. Probably a bit old. You got to realize that is weird because you got a Disney film in the first book, and maybe that's appropriate. I probably would say The Sword and the Stone is mostly appropriate, but from The Ill-Made Knight onwards, or The Witch of the Wood onwards is book 2, isn't it? You got a very different vibe, and by the end, of course, it's completely incomprehensible to a child, and to most adults. Another series, probably wait a while. I've already mentioned his Dark Materials and Harry Potter, but another series I'd like to read them, but might wait a little bit. It's more appropriate. It doesn't have all the same issues. Would be The Dark is Rising by Susan Cooper, which is very, very good. I think there is an emotional kind of robustness needed. That is a thing that develops. They're books I find eerie. I also think the end of the 5th book is legitimately very bad in a way that's almost incomprehensible. You're like, oh, great book, great book, great book. Just dreadful ending. To the point, I think a couple of people have commented on my video on it being like, yeah, that is actually really bad, isn't it? It's just a startling failure. I guess that could just be deleted from the book, couldn't it? I own them. I'm the bowler in this situation. We've got some other ideas coming up. It is Lord of the Rings, as I say as well. It's hard to know completely. Is there a perfect book list out there to go and get that really gives you all the stuff? As I say, I mentioned Honey for a Child's Heart. There's many books I googled loads of stuff. It's like, classic books for kids, or the best books children can read or something, and you get all kinds of stuff. And especially because no problem with my American viewers here, but so many American lists, I'm like, I literally have no idea what half these books are. I can probably get them, but the ability to really understand and research them is very limited for me. And there is a cultural gap there as well. We are divided by a common language, as the saying goes. Not always, but often. There's other stuff that is out there that we're interested in. I'm sure there'll be other things that we find and discover, other classic series. And there's stuff like Kingsley's Shakespeare and Church's Tales from Homer. Many, many versions of that, many books in that series, kind of sub-series. His version of Charlemagne. We've read some Legends of Britain, of Arthur and others, and we'll probably read some more Arthuriad stuff to them, including poems. You've got obviously Tennyson is reasonably accessible, so lots of stuff there, which covers many of these bases of connecting them to the great cultural tradition, giving them something filling and funny, or challenging, or that inspires courage, that's well written, and develops that sense of beauty. There's so many books. I'm happy to hear more, so if you have recommendations, please put them in the comments, and just talk about if you've got kids, what you read with your kids. Either way, if stuff that you enjoyed reading when you were a kid, I'd love to hear. Till next time.